I would be glad to take questions. Any brave souls? You think you're supposed to go up there if I can get a brave soul. There's a brave soul.
So you mentioned Atlas Shrugged, and in the book we all know, the country's really pushed to the point of desperation before anything happens. So in a democratic society where people have to vote to make these changes, how do you view us making these changes without being pushed to that extreme?
Well, that is a really good and really tough question. I'm in the optimistic category in this sense. I think people are driven by ideas. I think we got to where we are because of ideas. Very destructive, very bad ideas. And I think that we can change some of those ideas. And I think, interestingly enough, I think Rand is very critical in that regard. I think if you look at the great thinkers like Aristotle, they all occurred, the ones that really were defenders of individual rights and free ideas, most of them, John Locke, occurred before the Industrial Revolution. Rand had the advantage of seeing the power of individual freedom in productivity, which Aristotle, for example, never made the connection to. And I think she is actually a breakthrough philosopher in that regard, and I think her ideas can actually change people's mind. When I talk to people that believe in individual rights and free markets, most of them talk about Atlas or Fountainhead or one of Rand's books. And so I think probably for the first time in history, people can finally put it all together because we needed that kind of giant intellectual mind to do it. BB&T has, was mentioned earlier, we have 65 programs from the Moral Foundations of Capitalism at major colleges and universities in our footprint. And we have thousands of students that go through these programs, 25,000 a year. And we've had thousands of students tell us, wow, now I get it. Now I get why individual rights matters. Now I get why free society matters. Now I get why we can't have a free lunch. And I'm hoping they will be leaders. I think it's going to be your generation, though, and whether you guys can get into leadership fast enough, because I'm very pessimistic about my own generation, because people get 50 years old and older, it's hard to change their ideas, and a lot of people really are committed to getting a free lunch. Even the Tea Party movement, if you actually look at the Tea Party movement, they want to reduce government, and they don't want to raise taxes, but they don't want to do anything about Social Security or Medicare, right? And you got to do something about Social Security and Medicare, or all the rest of it doesn't work. So we've got to help people have the right ideas. And I think it is a question. I mean, the Founding Fathers were worried, and I think they'd be surprised democracy made it this long. And it'd be interesting, look, they were not Democrats. People forget this. The United States is not a democracy. We're a republic. And we have a Constitution. Those of you in the law, we're supposed to have a Constitution that protects, and the whole purpose of the Constitution is protecting individual rights. That's what the Bill of Rights is about. And what's happened, of course, is we've forgotten the Constitution. And that's how we've drifted to where we are. I mean, one thing that legal scholars can do is just go back and look at why the Founding Fathers it was an incredible event in history that many smart people happened to come together at one time with the right ideas, and given the Industrial Revolution was just starting, that they could do what they did is amazing. And not that everything they did was right, obviously, but they really, their goal was to limit the role of government. They got it. And they'd seen it, right? They just were in rebellion against a king that was doing a lot of things that if you go read the Declaration of Independence and compare it with what we do today to ourselves, and it's pretty, in fact, a lot of what we do today is a lot worse. And so, but ideas do matter. Ideas do matter. And I think and as things get worse, maybe this time people will see it different. Yes, sir.
I have a question about the structural method of our government. The Founding Fathers set up elections so that they would happen every 2 and 4 years. And it seems like part of the problem with addressing long-term issues like Social Security and Medicare is that makes politicians focused on the next election in 4 or 2 years. Do you think there's a structural problem with that, or is there a way to overcome that emphasis on the next election and address long-term problems?
Well, I think the structure could be improved. I think they did make a mistake, but it was a different world in the sense that they expected politicians to be normal people that were in politics for a short period of time, because that's what they wanted, personally. And I think, and also communications were a lot different. I think making the terms longer, but limiting the number of times you could be reelected would structurally help. I'm pessimistic that that by itself is a cure, though. I think, unfortunately, we elect the people that we deserve. We elect the people we deserve, and that's a tragedy. So we have to change the ideas. It's really the belief system that's taught in a lot of our universities, that's then taught to our teachers that teach our students, that has changed. We've gone, the principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are not taught in our educational system anymore, and the ideas of individual responsibility are not. Everybody's supposed to be taken care of and nurtured no matter how good or bad they are, and everybody should get the same. All those ideas are destructive ideas. So yes, the structure I think would help, but I don't think it's the cure. The cure is the ideas and changing the belief system, I believe. Yes, sir.
John, thank you so much for this. How would you go about thinking about and trying to predict if and when a catastrophic collapse in the value of the dollar will happen, and what preparations would you take in anticipation of that? Some of the factors that come to my mind are the total number of dollars that have been printed, the number of outstanding obligations, and also looking at how humans have reacted in previous situations in history where there has been a massive printing of a currency. What are your thoughts on all that?
Wow, that is a very critical question that I don't honestly have the answer for, but I am more worried about it than I think a lot of our politicians are. The United States has the reserve currency of the world. That means that people will accept dollars no matter what. If we didn't have the world's reserve currency, we would already be in an economic disaster, right? Because we're so deep in debt, people would, no telling what our interest rates would be. The fact that we have the world's reserve currency is a huge economic benefit to the United States. What Bernanke and the Federal Reserve have been doing is printing money like crazy. They had this QE2 and all this stuff. At some point, the rest of the world may lose confidence in the dollar. They may say, look, you know, this is just paper pictures of George Washington, right? And the faith and credit in this society is not functioning properly. Should I do that? A lot of people that are buying gold believe that. They're not people. They've got to. When I hear people criticize, I'm not recommending people buying gold, but when they criticize the rise in the price of gold, a lot of times they're confusing commodity prices with what happened in the gold market. If corn is going up, that can be speculation or it can be real shortage of corn, right? Gold is people believing that paper currencies, all of them, are getting ready to go. Because they're all based on governments that, how do you trust them, right? They've all made these commitments. The euro is under severe, it's not just Greece, by the way, it's everybody but Germany, and maybe France, although France is marginal. Everybody but Germany is, and we'll be interesting to see about that. So the speculators in gold are speculating that paper currencies are not going to hold up. I tend to think it's not going to happen in the immediate future, in the next couple years. I tend to think we've got 10 years in which where we go directionally will determine whether it happens. I would say if 10 years we're still doing what we're having, the debates we have now, the dollar will collapse. It might not be 10 years in a day, but there'll be, but when it collapses, it will be sudden. There'll be a lot of warning, but then when it happens, everybody will be stunned, and the consequences of the United States will be huge, huge economically. I think we probably got 10 years, but I think but if we kept going in the wrong direction, we might have less than 10 years, right? I think even the next election with the wrong combination could scare people enough that you could have a really huge reaction. I don't think that's likely to happen. So I think we've got a while, but I don't think it's not a huge amount of time unless we start changing direction. I think if we were direct, I don't think we have to fix all our problems, but we have to convince people that we have the ability and the will to fix them. We mostly have to convince them we have the will to fix them. That's, because even people that claim to be conservative, they jump on the proposal to deal with medical care for Medicaid, which was not that radical a proposal that was proposed. A number of conservatives dumped on it because Medicare is so sacrosanct. And so the issue is, do we have the will? And then the question will be, do we have the way? But I think Bernanke needs to wake up and realize that it could happen. he is very naive about, because he's an academic, he's never been in business. If you've been in the lending business and you've lent money to people, what happens when in a big credit, somebody owes you a lot of money, you see the problems coming, but you hope you're going to work it out, you hope you're going to work it out, and then one day it's over. It's not like it's over, and the company's bust, and that's how we would go as a reserve currency. I don't think it's going to happen in the next 10 years unless we don't at least start heading in the right direction. Yes, sir.
So the sense of pride and self-esteem that you described, it seems to me to depend to a large extent on incomes at least tracking inflation. And yet there's a lot of figures these days showing that they're not. And so, at least for the vast majority of workers. So I'm wondering what you see as the causes of that, if you think it's true. You know, some people say it's globalization, so we can, you know, hire people in other countries and jobs go overseas. Some people say it's technology. You know, you can run a company from your desk now to the extent that you couldn't before. And some people say it's policy, tax policy in particular. So what do you see as the causes, and what are your views on progressive taxation?
Okay, that's another series of important questions. Let me, first, there is a real debate about the fundamental question, what's happening to our standard of living. In fact, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal this morning, and the debate is not self-evident to me. There are, when they compute the percentage of people that are below the poverty line, they leave out government transfer payments. But what's happened, of course, since 1999, government transfer payments have gone up exponentially. So if you leave them out of the formulation, you're really misstating what's happening to people's income. So I think that the income negatives that are often postured aren't really quite right. The other thing, just as an older person observing this, people have stuff that we didn't have. You know, something like 95% of the families have color TVs. People have cell phones. You go down to the welfare office and they all drive there in a car, right? I didn't have a car. So it's clear the standard of living in the United States has risen. Now, has it risen as fast as it should have? No. Are there lots of things we're doing wrong? And could it start down? I think it is going to start down if it hadn't already started. So you know, I think there's a debate over what's really already happened, but where we're going, if we don't change direction, is material. I think globalization has played a factor, but in a different way than most people think, and I'll explain that in just a second. Globalization has actually raised our standard of living in many ways. We're buying goods from China that are cheaper and better than if we made them in the United States. Division of labor raises our standard of living. However, if you have workers that aren't trained to be competitive, that's bad for them, even though they can buy things cheaper. I think technology's raised our standard of living in a qualitative, not in reported income, but in the quality of life. I mean, the cell phone's a lot better. My grandmother had a 9-party phone in her house. There's a radical difference in quality of life with everybody carrying around a cell phone. So technology's raised our standard of living. But I do think we have two big problems. And the more fundamental problem, we have a failed K-12 education system. If any way you look at the statistics, we are not educating people to think in the K-12 system. You know, 25% of the students never graduate from high school. In a world where without a high school degree, you have no prayer. And a lot of students that graduate from high school can't read and write. We have a call center in eastern North Carolina with a high unemployment area. We can't hire people. We can't hire college, high school graduates into that call center because they can't speak English effectively. They've gone through high school, graduated, and they don't speak English effectively. That's a failed education system. And here's what's happened. This is how globalization is. At the lower end of the skill set, you are now those people are now competing with other people throughout the rest of the world that are willing to work a lot harder for a lot less. It's harder to replicate somebody that's really smart, right? We are competing, but really smart people are always valuable. There's always a shortage of smart people. Anybody who runs a business get that. It's the not very smart people or the not very educated people or the not very thoughtful people that aren't very valuable. And they are competing against people in the rest of the world that are willing to work a lot harder for a lot less. So unless they're properly educated, they are doomed to not have a good quality of life. I'll tell you, I've for years tried to fix the public schools. I would argue the public school system is not fixable. It's a massive self-supporting bureaucracy run for the benefit of the bureaucrats, the administrators, the unions themselves, and to some degree the teachers, and not for the students. I mean, I just believe that from many years of experience. I think we've got to privatize education. and we've got to create incentives for innovation. And people in business talk about we like to innovate. The truth is businesses hate to innovate. The reason businesses, that's why they go to the government to stop innovation, right? Crony capitalists try to keep people from innovating. The attack on Microsoft was not initiated by the Justice Department, it was initiated by Microsoft's competitors, right? But we have to innovate to the degree we have a free market or we go out of business. Public schools don't innovate. What happens if a public school does a really bad job? It gets more money. What happens if a business has a really bad job? It goes out of business. We have to create an incentive for innovation. If you think about a market economy, what makes it work is really a bunch of experiments. There are hundreds of thousands, millions of experiments going on, but by the way, most of which are failing. For every Google, there's 10,000 failed Googles. Anybody in the technology business knows that. But it's very analogous to what Edison said about the light bulb. You know, people criticize him. It took 1,000 experiments to invent the light bulb. He said the 999 that failed were absolutely as important as the last one that worked. And so when you take out the learning process, when businesses can't fail, you destroy innovation and creativity. If you think about how far technology's advanced and how little advancement we've had in education compared to everything else, it's kind of stunning. I personally don't know exactly what the answer is. I do know an incentive system where we subsidize students, subsidize parents, and have a private education system and not subsidize the schools will innovate and will be and there's a solution for low-income kids so they can become globally competitive. Walmart's a classic example of an experiment that worked. It's improved the quality of life for low-income people on this planet pretty dramatically if you study the numbers, and created lots of jobs, by the way, in the process. But we've got a failed education system, and that's what's driving unemployment in a certain fundamental. It's not highly educated, smart people that can't get jobs. They can complain about the quality of jobs. Every employee of this country will tell you they're trying to hire highly skilled people. There's a shortage of highly skilled people in the United States. There's a massive amount of not very skilled people, not very productive. A lot of them came out of the construction industry, by the way, and they're not bad human beings. We just taught them how to build houses instead of how to do other stuff. And now they don't want to accept the reduction in compensation to learn a new skill because they're 50 years old and don't want to do it, or 40 years old and don't want to do it. Or they're minority teenagers who the school system has failed them. We've set the minimum wage, all-in cost is about $10 an hour. What that means is a lot of small businesses can't afford to pay an unskilled worker $10 an hour. Congress doesn't want to understand this. Economic laws are laws just like the laws of physics. They're non-negotiable like the law of gravity is. The fundamental underlying economic law is called the law of supply and demand. It's proven by Adam Smith in 1776. It's just as good as Newton's laws of motion, okay? What the law of supply and demand says is there's a price that clears the market. We're supply and demand equal. If you raise the price above the market clearing price, some of the supply will not be used. If you went to the grocery store tomorrow and milk was $100 a gallon, you probably wouldn't buy milk, and a lot of milk would sit around, right? Milk would be unsold. If you raise the minimum wage above the market clearing price, people go unemployed. We raise the minimum wage 40% in the face of a recession. 41% actually in the face of a recession. It's not surprising a lot of these construction workers who had to get entry-level jobs so they could get paid better in the future, but they had to learn something that was valuable, can't get a job because a small business can't pay $10 an hour, including all-in cost, to hire an unskilled worker or a minority kid coming out of a failed education system. And so that's policy. Minimum wage is a policy issue that's been very destructive because you have a lot of, my first job I made $1 an hour. And even with inflation, that's a lot less than minimum wage. And I cleared roads. I did what prison guards do now. But I learned a lot. One thing I learned is I didn't want to do that job, right? The second thing I learned was to show up and work hard, which are very valuable things. And so people have to get a job to get started. So that's a policy decision. The minimum wage is creating a lot of unemployment. And then all these other policy things I just described. So I think it's a combination of a failed education system and a series of bad policy decisions. And ironically, globalization and technology have probably actually helped raise our standard of living, not necessarily create more jobs in the U.S., but improve the quality of our lives.
You spoke a lot about the regulations being very tight during the last few years. From your perspective or from BBT's perspective, what's the way forward in terms of regulatory reform in the United States specifically?
Well, if I were in charge, I would say that every regulatory agency had to eliminate 75% of their regulations in the next 6 months and reduce their regulatory staff by 75%. And I think that, and the interesting thing, I went to work in 1970. We still have more regulations than we had in 1970. And we were doing, from a regulatory perspective, we're fine. I think at least 3/4 of the regulations in the United States are unnecessary add-ons, and at least 3/4 of staff. And I'd mandate they get rid of the staff, because if they got staff, they're going to create work, right? They can take one regulation and make it. And these staff, if you look at this number, the staffs have exploded and the regulations have exploded. I was trying to, I'm trying to remember this number. I think this is the last 5 years that we've added 65,000 pages of regulations to the regulatory registers in the U.S. in 5 years. 65. Just reading the names of the regulations there's a wall they have in the Library of Congress, and it's about 30 feet long and 10 feet high, and it just has the names, not just the names of the regulations, and it's full of books. I mean, so that's just the name, and everyone has. So I mean, we have a massive over-regulatory structure, and I would have a radical. Eventually, I'd get rid of even more, but I think in 6 months, you could say get rid of 75% of it, and that would be in business. We have to do that kind of stuff fairly often. We don't get so far out of line we got to do 75%, but we have to go back to ground zero a lot and ask people to rethink. Would you really do this if you were building it from zero? And what we do is we never get rid of a regulation, right? We just add on, add on, add on, add on, add on. We never go back and visit anything again. Well, I think here you have to make a definition of what you think the role of law is, of government is. I think the role of government is really basically 3 things. One, I think we need a military to protect us from the bad guys, and we need, but it ought to be defending the United States. We shouldn't be involved in 3 wars. It's hard to believe that we have any benefit in the United States. I think that's a terrible economic and human mistake, my view. We should have a military that defends the United States. We need a policeman to, punish the bad guys, put them in jail, and we need an effective court system. And what the purpose of the court system would be basically to enforce contracts, and we need it. But contract law is a real. You guys are expert. I'm not an expert in contract. It takes a lot of science and a lot of thought. And in a certain sense, we could argue we don't need any regulations in that context. But I do think there are regulations that are really about enforcing contracts. And I think there's a rule for regulatory structures that are really in the contract enforcement business. And theoretically, they don't have to be called regulation. They can just be rule of law. But I think in practice, making sure the contracts get enforced and keeping them and actually doing them in such a way that we don't have to always get into court systems would be is a more efficient way. But my 75% would probably be the first row, and then there might be more we could get rid of in that regard. But I think there is. I mean, I think that I personally am an advocate. I do not believe in anarchy. I mean, anarchy is failed. You can go to Somalia. So I know there's some libertarians that are anarchists. I think they're more dangerous than communists, speaking for me. I think there's an important role for government in the protection of individual rights, to keep me from stealing from you and taking advantage of you or committing fraud. And that's why we need good laws, and we need an effective court system. But we don't. It shouldn't be in the redistribution of wealth business or deciding that green energy is better than black energy or whatever kind of. Those are not roles for government. That's not what government should be doing. Yes, sir.
Sir, thank you for the lecture. I come from a country, Brazil, that practically does everything against what you're saying, and we are achieving quite a huge success in economic development these years. For example, government taxes rich people in order to distribute this money to poor people directly. We pay money to poor families that do not have some level of income per month. Say they gain $100 per month, so the government gives another 100. According to all the economists back in my country, this is allowing our economy to grow an extra 1% per year by putting more people into the market. And you also said something about Keynes, the economist. Keynes. You said something about the thing about digging a hole and filling the holes. A classical lesson in economics. Actually, countries like China, India, and Brazil are following this lesson from Keynes, and by doing that, because we make a lot of public works and even some that are not necessary at all in order to keep the employment rate high. We have a very good fiscal situation now. Even today, Brazil, China, Russia, and India are meeting in Washington in order to decide how much money they will lend to the European Union. So, are we in the wrong track?
Yes. Yeah, I think Brazil will have severe economic problems not long in the future. And if you study the history of the Brazilian economy, it's one of these. And your standard of living is still dramatically less than the United States. And also, if you look at your tax policies, you have a huge amount of tax fraud in those kind of economies.
37% of tax is the same level of Sweden. We tax 37% of the economic activity.
Yeah. I think Brazil will not do well long term. I think it's going to be interesting to see how that goes. I don't know what you're talking about in China. I don't know about India, but China has basically two different economies. They have a very privatized economy with much less regulation than the United States, and they have all the state-owned industries. The state-owned industries are having huge economic problems being subsidized by a very successful private economy that's much less regulated than the United States. Also, the United States has a much heavier, you can talk about, we have a welfare system too, you know, and we distribute a whole lot more than $100 a month. Social Security and Medicare and a lot of those things are actually bigger, they're coming out of a much bigger economy, but the actual benefits going, the food stamps and all that, in dollars are much higher than in an economy like Brazil. So your subsidy programs are actually pretty small by U.S. standards. They're bigger as a percentage. I don't know now. They may be bigger as a percentage of the economy. And of course, the thing that sparked Brazil growing was finally creating sound currency, which is one of the United States' problems, in that we have been printing money like crazy, where Brazil has actually created a sound currency, and that stabilized the economic system. You also have to look at countries relative to their potential. I mean, Brazil has phenomenal natural resources. It's got a phenomenally good workforce. So one of the questions, yes, it's doing better. Is it doing well relative to the United States? No. Should it do better? Yes. Will these policies make it better? Some, you know, the Brazilian regulatory structure is not any more difficult or more destructive than in the, I know a lot of companies that operate in Brazil, and they actually get more subsidies from, you know, more positives from the Brazilian government than we do in the United States. So I don't know that the government is more anti-business. It's hard, you know, it's hard across economies to make those kind of issues. The Chinese, I think, are going to have some big problems for a different set of reasons. They have a demographic problem. The way the Japanese spurred huge growth in Japan was by not having babies. Babies are expensive. Now, the dilemma with not having babies is sometimes you don't get young people that are very productive. So Japan created an economic boom. They chose on their own not to have babies. But then they are now creating an economic bust because they don't have enough young people. China's got the same phenomenon. In their case, it was a government-driven decision to have one baby per family. So they have radically reduced the number of babies. That has a big short-term impact on the quality of life in your economy, because babies are expensive. They suck up a lot of resources. It has a big negative impact when there are not any young people to produce and you got too many old people. The Chinese, the reason the Chinese are saving so much and why it's a problem for us is they're not having babies. They want their money back, and they're going to expect us to pay them back, and that's why their savings rate is phenomenal. And people say, well, it's Orientals or something different. No, they don't have any babies. Well, if you don't have any children, you got to save money because your children can't take care of you, and that's why the Japanese have such a high savings rate. But they don't have the children to take care of them, right? So they're expecting us to pay us back. That's why our debt with the Chinese will become a problem if we can't pay it back, because we're their savings vehicle, and they don't have any babies. So all of this stuff, you know, my point is there's public policies, there's real world phenomena going on. There's stabilization of the currency in Brazil was huge. And when you've seen Brazil's had these big spurts when they had stable currency, then when inflation's got out of control, they've done this. And so all that stuff is kind of hard to filter through.
What I mean is that although the stabilization of the currency, that actually we have this stabilization since 1995, then we have some peaks in the currency. But what happened that really helped the economy to grow was this distribution of money that goes directly against of what you're saying. Because we had this amount of poor people, and today I saw a magazine saying that 60% of the American population would be considered below the poverty line of the United States. I think it's $10,000 per year of income. And when we walk here in Cambridge, you can see many solid stores and all. What I'm asking you is that if the government would distribute money in a more smart manner, in a smarter manner here in the United States, wouldn't that boost economy?
I think the United States already has a much bigger welfare system than Brazil has, dramatically higher. The statistic you quoted takes out government transfer payments. That's one of the problems with it. Somebody was asking that question earlier with the statistic. And our standard of the poverty line is way, way above the poverty line in Brazil if you actually look at the numbers. So
yes, it's a proportional thing, of course, because the income here is much higher.
Right.
But you
don't distribute money to the people that at the level that we are already distributing money at.
Yes.
So, I mean, to me, it's a different problem.
But the welfare system, just for example, like you said, it's strange because here in the United States, as far as I know, I may be wrong because I've not been here a long time, but if I have a cancer problem and I do not have insurance, I won't be able to be treated.
That's not so. Hospitals have to treat you if you go into emergency.
But I'm going to be broken afterwards because someone will have to. I will have to pay it.
Well, if you hadn't got insurance, if you bought insurance, you won't. But if you don't have insurance, the hospital does have to treat you. Medical care in the United States is objectively the best in the world by a long, long standard. That's just a fact.
I see.
And much better than in Brazil. In fact, one of our problems, you can argue, is we have too good a medical care. We've invested way too much as a percentage of our gross national product into medical care. We spend more than any other country in the world. And how productive that is argumentative because a lot of it goes to people that are over 80 years old, which you can argue about how good or bad that is. But we have the best medical system by a huge margin, and the United States does almost all the medical research in things like pharmaceuticals and those kind of things. So, and any hospital has to treat any of these nonprofit offices, which are most hospitals, vast majority of hospitals and nonprofit have to treat anybody that comes in. That's just the way it is. So if you get here's the opposite. Go to Canada where they have socialized medicine, and if you get cancer, you will get treated, but it'll be 6 months from now. And you may die while you're waiting to get treated. And you'll get it for free if you get it. That's why lots of people with serious illnesses come to the United States from Canada, where they have a socialized medical system, but the way they control the cost is delaying the treatment. They have, the United States has 10 times as many of technology machines like CRTs and any of those kind of machines that Canada does. So we treat them very fast, and we treat poor people in the United States. Whether that's good or bad, that's a different question. In fact, it may be one of our economic problems. We're spending too much on medicine.
Thank you, sir.
We're out of time, but I think we can all appreciate it.